So thank you everyone for coming and welcome to the Financial History Network webinar series. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sauter, who is going to present the paper, Get There First or Get Shot Down First, Financial Policy and the Venture Capitalists' Appetite for Risk, 1974-1990s. So Dr. Sauter is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies. They are the author of The Coming Swarm, DDoS Actions, Hacktivism, and Civil Disobedience on the Internet. Their current research focuses on the history of finance in high technology, the innovation economy, and the ways in which corporate policies impact the security and rights of individuals. They received their PhD from McGill University in 2020, and they hold a master's degree in Comparative Media Studies from the MIT. They have held research fellowships at the Berkman-Klein Center for Internet and Society and New America. Their work has been published in several magazines and periodicals, and she has been featured as an expert on, they have been featured as an expert on technology, culture, and politics on several news and cable network. Thank you so much for being here with us. As usual, you will have 30 minutes to share your presentation with us, and then 30 minutes for Q&A, and the audience can raise their hands using the corresponding function on Zoom, or they can just type their questions on chat, and I'm gonna read them out loud. So the floor is yours, and thank you so much for coming.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Like Paula said, I'm Mal Sauter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College of Information Studies. And today I'm going to be presenting part of a book project that I've been working on for the last few years on the role of essentially East Coast financiers in the development of venture capital policy in the 1970s. In particular, I'm focusing on the role of a group of guys called the Small Business Administration Task Force on Venture and Equity Capital for Small Business. This task force was also known as the Casey Task Force after its chairman, William J. Casey, who's this smiling gentleman right here. Casey is possibly better known for later going on to direct the CIA under Ronald Reagan. But in 1976, he was an experienced business publisher, tax attorney, financial bureaucrat, as well as a self-identified venture capitalist based in New York. The other members of the task force, which included Charles Lee of Newcourt Securities, were also predominantly East Coast-based finance professionals. These professionals and others had begun at this time to explore the potential of a new mode of investment that was sometimes called venture capital and sometimes called risk capital in this period, so about the very, very late 60s through the 1970s. In the 1970s and even up through the 1980s, there was little agreement about what venture capital actually was. Was it a loan? Was it equity investment? Was it assistance in equipment? What its norms and practices are, and what the source of investment funds was, and how firms were to be structured. Compounding this confusion, the dissolution or disappearance of several high-profile firms in the 1970s led many in the general business public to question whether this thing called venture capital would survive the decade as a distinct financial practice. The cartoon shown here on this slide was published in daily newspapers in the winter of 1974 and syndicated across North America, and it indicates the extent to which venture capital as a collection of investment practices was sort of broadly considered a flash in the pan by the mid-1970s, an interesting but ultimately unsuccessful blip in the financial and business landscape. So what you see here is, so the cartoonist who did this this looks like a New Yorker cartoon. It's not a New Yorker cartoon, though the cartoonist did draw for the New Yorker. This was part of his syndicated daily strip, which appeared, as I said, in newspapers across the country. And what you see is a group of gentlemen having what Reed Dennis would describe as a New Yorker type cocktail party. And one of them is saying, "And venture capital, remember venture capital?" And the quote to the side is Reed Dennis describing how his first encounter with this cartoon was encountering it tacked to the back of the office door of an undersecretary of the US Treasury. And he's saying, this is about as far gone as you can get. Someone has a cartoon, like a a government bureaucrat and regulator has this cartoon tacked to the back of his door, making fun of this thing that I was doing. And that was pretty wild. So how did venture capital go from being basically an object of fun to being one of the most charismatic funding models for high technology in the US in a very relatively short period of time? So this talk focuses on a policy shift that was credited both at the time and since with saving, quote unquote, saving venture capital, which is the 1979 reformulation of the ERISA prudence standard by the Department of Labor. The reformulation of the ERISA prudence standard brought about the financialization of pensions, exposing them to high-risk investments, and in particular venture capital, and enabling the rise of both venture capital investment in general and the institutionally funded limited partnership firm model that dominates the space today. These policy shifts had a huge impact on the capital makeup and practice of venture capital investment. In the decade immediately following, pension funds went from providing 15% of capital invested in venture funds in 1978 to 46% in 1988, with the total pool of investment capital increasing from 32.4 million to 1.3 billion with a B. At the same time, the share contributed by individual investors declined from 32% in 1978 to 8% in 1988. In the same time period, limited partnership firms went from managing 35% of the venture capital pool to roughly 75%. The ERISA prudence reformulation was strongly argued for by the Casey Task Force as well as others in the financial sector. Task Force member Charles Lee of Newcourt Securities has been credited by many contemporaries within the venture capital community as leading the lobbying effort that ultimately led to the Department of Labor's actions in 1979. While various SEC rule changes that I'm not going to address in this talk flew under the radar to a certain extent, though they were also very influential here, the ERISA prudence reformulation was controversial at the time and for decades following. Tracing these shifts and the debates surrounding them shows us that the current model of venture capital was not inevitable, and its embeddedness in the high technology sector is not the result of a natural synergy between this funding model and high technology. Rather, the rise of venture capital and its ties to high technology were intentionally crafted, in large part by established Wall Street financiers and Washington bureaucrats who are pursuing notably neoconservative and neoliberal agendas. In order to discuss these shifts and their significance, we have to lay some groundwork. First, I will provide a brief history of prudence in finance and trusts. And second, I will briefly, ever so briefly, review ERISA itself. Then I will review the debates that surrounded the Department of Labor's reformulation of the prudence standard in ERISA and its ultimate outcomes. So first, trusts. Trusts are a financial vehicle wherein money and assets are managed by a fiduciary or a trustee on behalf of another person who, for whatever reason, is deemed incapable of managing their own affairs. Prudence as a concept in finance dates to 1830 in the Supreme Court decision in Harvard v. Amory. This decision establishes the prudent man rule with regard to investments and management of trusts as an alternative to something called the legal list rule, where the legal list rule had previously provisioned an actual list of safe investments a fiduciary might make, such as government bonds. The prudent man rule introduces a standard of conduct. Specifically, a fiduciary should conduct himself faithfully and exercise sound discretion in the manner of men of prudence managing their own affairs. This standard is one of conduct and not result, and specifically, it is the conduct of a non-professional person managing his own business affairs. In the years of jurisprudence that followed, we get layers of interpretation around the prudent man rule, solidifying what conduct qualified as prudent and what qualified as imprudent. Most notably for our purposes, it is important to note that the prudent man rule applies to individual investments, regardless of the context of the market or the strategy of the trust portfolio as a whole, and that investments in, quote, new and untried enterprises were considered imprudent per se, along with investments made with the goal of growing the principal of the trust. If you want to make more money, you want the principal of the trust to grow. That is actually an imprudent aim. The goal is to preserve the trust principal from risk first and at the most granular level. Conduct that exposes the principal of the trust to risk, even if it resulted in the growth of the trust, could and did result in fiduciary liability and fines. Pensions are a particular kind of financial vehicle. They could be considered either contracted future benefits due to an employee upon retirement or they could be considered deferred present wages, held in trust by the employer until such time as they are to be dispensed to retired employees. As such, pensions borrow the paternalistic form of the trust. ERISA, which is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, was passed in 1974 following a gestation period of over a decade. The act was intended to protect workers' pensions, insurance payouts, and medical reimbursements from collapse due to mismanagement, fraud, or refusal by one party to fulfill their contractual obligations. Passage of the bill was prompted by several high-profile instances of pension fund collapse, being abruptly canceled, or them being rendered moot by unreasonable qualification requirements imposed by new company owners. A complex piece of legislation, ERISA had a range of impacts on the practical function of pensions and some other types of institutional capital funds. Of particular interest here is the bill's establishment of a mandatory federal prudence standard for the fiduciaries of private pension funds. Prior to the passage of ERISA, there was no federal prudence standard for trusts in general, and no mandatory prudence standard applied to pension funds in particular. Rather, the fiduciaries of pension funds had been guided by articulations of prudence and other regulations that were developed and implemented at the state level and which varied state by state. Fiduciaries often use exculpatory contracted clauses to exempt themselves from these prudence standards, shielding themselves from liability for losses suffered by the funds under their care. ERISA established a single mandatory prudence standard for the fiduciaries of pension funds, enforced by the Department of Labor, and disallowed exculpatory contractual clauses. All fiduciaries of pension funds, public and private, were now to be bound by a shared standard of prudence and shared rules governing liability. In the years following its passage, the financial sector loudly criticized ERISA. Financiers and pension fiduciaries complained it was too complex and that it overly restricted investment. Their congressional allies referred to the bill as the Lawyers' Relief Act of 1974 and every rotten idea since Adam. Some commentators went so far as to lay the blame for the downturn in underwritings, IPOs, and reported investments in small business during 1974 and 1976 directly at the feet of ERISA. These critics argue that the harsh restrictions and liabilities created by ERISA caused pension funds to concentrate their investments in conservative government bonds or the common stock of well-known established companies, which are so-called blue chips or the favorite 50. The Department of Labor countered this criticism by pointing out that the prudence standards implemented by ERISA was no different than the prudence standards which had already existed for fiduciaries of trusts, generally at the state level. They argued that the downturn in investment in IPOs in the years following the passage of ERISA was more likely due to the recession and harsh market conditions that had arrived in 1974. In 1976, the Casey Task Force formed part of the chorus blaming ERISA for the so-called equity crisis that it had been convened to address. The task force recommended a set of reforms to ERISA as part of its collection of policy reforms. First, the report recommended that ERISA be clarified to, quote, declare a policy that pension funds may invest in a broad spectrum of American companies within the prudent man rule, and that it applies to the total portfolio rather than each individual investment. Now, this recommendation represents an interpretive shift, wherein the prudence of any one investment is considered in the context of the portfolio as a whole rather than on an individual basis. And the task force went on to say, this shift would allow for losses, large and small, by one set of investments to be compensated for by gains elsewhere in the portfolio without the fiduciary being considered to have breached their obligations of prudence. Now, if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that this recommendation sharply departs from previous norms of interpretation and implementation of prudent standards in trusts and pensions. As previously mentioned, the dominant understanding of prudent standards as applied to fiduciaries was that the prudence of investments were judged on an individual basis, that is, stock by stock. Fiduciaries could and sometimes were held liable in the courts for losses of individual securities within a portfolio if they were significant enough or represented particularly egregious mismanagement or malfeasance. This liability held even if the gains of the portfolio as a whole outweighed the losses. This possibility of significant personal liability on the part of fiduciaries, which may be encountered by a single bad investment in an otherwise successful portfolio, was intended to instill caution and conservatism, as each individual investment would represent a significant personal and legal financial risk. The Department of Labor official wrote in 1978 that this placing of liability and risk on the shoulders of employers and fiduciaries was intentional in ERISA, stating ERISA's critics are correct in saying that the law shifted the burden of risk from the workers to the companies. That is precisely what ERISA intended, and that is the way it should be. Lloyd Benson, ERISA's main legislative champion, defended the ERISA prudence standard in 1977 in an interview in the Washington Post, saying, "No one is going to bring a liability suit against a pension manager because the stock of General Motors or IBM went down the tube, but they might if he invested in Widget Corp." So we can see then that the ERISA prudence standard was formulated in keeping with traditional prudence standards goals in keeping risky and speculative investments out of the pension investment portfolio. In advocating for interpreting the prudence of individual investments only in the context of the portfolio as a whole, the Casey report's recommendations would adopt a method of understanding and balancing risk known as modern portfolio theory, or MPT. MPT was developed by economist Harry Markowitz in the early 1950s while at Rand at the University of Chicago with Milton Friedman. Markowitz's theory presented a new understanding of risk as a value-neutral quantification of the volatility and profit potential of a given security and of a portfolio as a whole. Although MPT came to influence business circles in the 1970s, at the time of the Casey Report's publication in 1977, the theory was not yet fully integrated into financial and trust regulation. MPT argued that the value of a single investment could not be judged in isolation. Rather, a security could only be evaluated properly in the context of a complete portfolio. There, its risk could be understood in relation to and balanced against the risk of other held securities and of the market as a whole. The goal of MPT properly applied was the creation of efficient portfolios. In an efficient portfolio, the risk inherent to a particular security or their alpha risk are balanced against other securities in the portfolio. The portfolio as a whole is balanced against the systemic risk of the market itself or the beta risk. For example, a portfolio that holds shares in, say, a new experimental technological enterprise that has the potential for high profitability but also high risk of failure could be balanced by holding a much more conservative investment, such as US Treasury bonds. At least 2 attempts had been made to pass legislative amendments to ERISA between 1974 and 1976. Both of these attempts failed. The Casey report did not recommend a legislative remedy to the ERISA prudence standard. Rather, the report recommended clarifications that might be issued directly by the Department of Labor without legislative interference or oversight. In 1979, 2 years after the publication of the Casey report, the Department of Labor issued such clarification to ERISA's prudent man rule. This clarification adopted and applied the principles of modern portfolio theory without identifying it as such. And the clarification is now reproduced on the slide, and I'm not going to read it to you. In addition to shifting the interpretation of ERISA's prudent man rule into alignment with modern portfolio theory, the department's clarification explicitly established that pension funds could invest up to 10% of their assets in venture capital funds specifically, a move that was in keeping with a recommended 5% basket clause that the Casey report had recommended. These changes to ERISA, presented as matters of interpretation rather than fundamental shifts, in fact dramatically transformed the venture capital industry. They opened up a huge source of investment capital for firms pursuing the institutionally supported limited partnership firm model. Venture capital historian Paul Gompers calls the ERISA revision the single most important factor accounting for the increase in money flowing to the venture capital sector. The effects of the ERISA revision were apparent as soon as 5 months after they took effect. Senator Gaylord Nelson wrote in his December 1979 report to the Select Committee on Small Business, together these items, the 1978 reduction in capital gains tax and the ERISA prudent man clarification, have resulted in the flow of more than $500 million in new venture capital to the small business community since the end of 1978. And as a result, the venture capital industry has been able to survive. As I mentioned at the head of this talk, the lion's share of this new influx of capital flowed to firms using the institutionally supported limited partnership firm structure. In the years that followed, limited partnership firms went from managing 35% of the venture capital pool to 75%. Beyond opening the door to pension fund participation in venture capital funds, the move also catalyzed the process of dislodging the prudent man standard from the center of trust law in general and normalizing the application of modern portfolio theory to trusts in general. The incorporation of MPT into the ERISA prudence standard was controversial among regulators and legal professionals for decades following the Department of Labor's clarification. There hasn't been a lot of tracing in the history community of this debate, and a lot of the writing about ERISA and the prudence clarification seems to think that that the interpretation was correct, that this is just another move that the Department of Labor made to sort of like say, oh, but this is what we really meant. But this was a move that in the sort of scholarly literature and also in the professional literature was deeply controversial and kept being controversial for years.
I feel like
someone is talking.
We have a lot of.
I'm talking. Those arguing in favor of the incorporation of MPT argued that the prudence language of the original ERISA statute in referring to standards of prudence deriving from the operation of an enterprise of a like character with like aims inherently created a new standard, and this is known as the prudent expert standard. This standard, it was argued, acknowledged that pension fiduciaries operated in a professional investing community, one which already incorporated modern portfolio theory, and that the prudence of their actions should be judged against this community itself. The prudent expert, it was argued, possessed special professional knowledge of the financial sphere. He was able to avail himself of sophisticated strategies, theories, and practices outside the amateur knowledge and abilities of the average prudent man of common trust law. Several commentators argue that the prudent expert standard created a standard of prudence based on conduct rather than results. The common law prudence standard held an expectation that the trust principle would be preserved first and foremost. Under the prudent expert theory, however, a trustee who could show that he had abided by the prevailing professional conduct standards of his community of similarly situated trustees could be held to have behaved prudently, regardless of losses suffered by the principal or the fund. Many commentators who accepted the prudent expert interpretation of ERISA's prudence standard advanced the argument one step further, arguing that the prudent expert standard should be permitted to make use of the most sophisticated and innovative financial practices and theories available in their management of pension fund portfolios. A representative comment here on the slide has Richard Posen in an article appearing in the Financial Analyst Journal saying, by establishing the prudent expert standard, ERISA opened the door to modern investment practices. For example, because most investment experts for large financial institutions view their investment decisions in terms of the whole portfolio, ERISA should allow that pension managers adopt that viewpoint. The opposing argument that MPT is fundamentally incompatible with any meaningful standards of prudence is perhaps best summed up by an article appearing in the Syracuse Law Review in 1993, almost 15 years after the Department of Labor issued their clarification, titled Trustee Investment, the Prudent Person Rule or Modern Portfolio Theory, You Make the Choice. The author writes, the prudent person rule has been considered too restrictive and conservative, with the effect of harming the trust beneficiaries the most. On the other hand, modern portfolio theory has been considered a radical departure from the traditional standard, risking the trust principle to speculative investments. The answer to whether modern portfolio theory should replace the prudent person rule is not entirely clear. The view that MPT and dominant understandings of prudence were incompatible was also held by those advocating for the application of MPT to trusts and pensions. Beavis Longstreet, the SEC commissioner under President Ronald Reagan, made this argument in his 1986 treatise on the prudent man rule, wherein he argued that the only processes of risk management that might be considered imprudent and not any particular investment in and of itself. In 1990, the Restatement Third of Trusts unequivocally endorsed modern portfolio theory and venture capital investment itself. And I've here replicated the language from the Restatement Third of Trusts that says like, modern portfolio theory, we're super into it, and I'm not going to read it to you right now. This was in and of itself, again, deeply controversial, with law professor Paul Haskell calling the Restatement Third's articulation of the prudent investor standard a radical departure from previous understandings of the prudent man standard. And here I'd like to sort of present like the key point of my argument, which is that ERISA is not only this thing that really sort of kicks off a lot of changes in trust law, but it is in and of itself a risk shift. So ERISA prudence reform was an early step in a process that ultimately culminates in the Restatement III's establishment of the prudent investor rule, which wholeheartedly embraces modern portfolio theory. So we changed the entire fundamental interpretation of trust law to bring in modern portfolio theory with this restatement. Through this process, the trust vehicle transitions from a fundamentally paternalistic protectionist mechanism that prioritized the accountable preservation of assets by a strong actor, that is the trustee, on behalf of a weak actor, that is the beneficiary, to simply another asset class in the financial market. The high concentration of capital in pension funds and institutional trust vehicles, otherwise governed by the prudent man standard, was a stated concern of the task force and others active in the professional conversation regarding financial investment at the time. The 1979 ERISA clarification and the subsequent 1990 introduction of the prudent expert or investor rule frees pension funds and trusts in general from the intentional conservatism and risk aversion of the prudent man rule, exposing a huge amount of capital to relatively unfettered participation in the markets in general and in venture capital funds in particular. I argue that the ERISA prudence changes and the subsequent heavy investment in pension funds by pension funds in venture capital funds constitutes a type of risk shift between the spheres of labor and finance. This risk shift resulted in an environment where the venture capitalist was painted as a vital and patriotic market actor with special skills and capacities for risk, while policies and firm structures were favored that allowed the venture capitalist to avoid meaningful personal risk almost entirely. This shift empowers the financial sector at the expense of organized labor and workers who did not participate in the financial markets. The risk shift is a concept popularized by political scientist Jacob Hacker. He identifies the 1970s and 1980s as a time period where we see multiple moves at the levels of finance, industry, and policy to shift the financial and moral responsibility for healthcare, education, and retirement savings from government and employers to private individuals. For Hacker, a central moment in this transformation is the creation of the 401k individual retirement account in 1978. For those of us who may be unfamiliar, a 401k defined contribution retirement plan replaces a defined benefits pension. In a defined benefits pension, the benefits a worker will receive in the future are contractually defined at their point of enrollment. In a defined contribution plan, however, like the 401k, only the contributions of a worker and their employer, which can vary widely, and their tax treatment are defined. The worker is encouraged through tax incentives to invest their 401 savings in financial markets in order to stay ahead of inflation and grow their retirement savings at a faster rate. The rise of 401k plans in the 1980s exploded participation in the financial markets, with participation more than doubling between 1980 and 1989. Hacker argues that the rise of the 401k shifted the risk of preparing for retirement from corporate employers to employees who found themselves forced into financial markets through the 401k vehicle. Financiers benefited from the additional brokerage and management fees paid by the new market participants, as well as benefiting from the increased liquidity of the market in general. Workers now found their retirement savings gagged to the sometimes rising, sometimes falling fortunes of the financial markets, with little meaningful control and no guarantee that sufficient funds would await them upon retirement. The ERISA prudence clarification constitutes an equally important and parallel risk shift, one that Hacker does not address in his work. 401k plans pushed individuals into market participation through multiple vehicles at varying levels of risk and return, including mutual funds, index funds, employee stock plans, and common stock acquisition. In aggregate, the impact of the financial market was huge. However, as noted above, it took about a decade to achieve this doubling in market participation. The ERISA prudence clarification, however, created a direct path between the assets of pension funds, that is, the deferred wages of workers, and high-risk market participation through venture capital investment. Substantial financial benefits in the form of increased investment by pension funds were felt by the venture capital industry in less than a year. Within a decade, of the amount of capital pension funds invested in venture capital had increased by over 4,000%, with the limited partnership firm structure directly benefiting from this shift. Both the ERISA prudence clarification and the growing infrastructural preference for limited partnership firms contributed to this risk shift, as both serve to reduce or eliminate liability and the need for personal investment on the part of pension fund fiduciaries and venture capitalists. The ERISA clarification and subsequent adoption of MPT by the Restatement III gives fiduciaries and financiers control over large blocks of assets and contributed to the liquidity of the markets without binding these actors to meaningful standards of performance. The limited partnership firm structure similarly allowed the venture capitalists to invest and profit from the capital gains of assets that were held in trust for the benefit of others. In this way, the combined effect of ERISA reform and the limited partnership firm structure constituted a significant risk shift from fiduciaries, financiers, and venture capitalists to the weakest party in these arrangements, which is pension fund beneficiaries. The deferred wages of beneficiaries are exposed to the risk of the financial markets and to the especially high risks involved in venture capital investing. If the pension fund suffers losses that imperil future payouts, these losses will be felt by the beneficiaries in their retirement in the future, while venture capitalists and fiduciaries are in the present structurally shielded from most personal losses and liability. I discovered this week that there is a Fortnite character named ERISA, and now you have to know that too. And this is the end of the talk. So thank you so much for listening, and let's all enjoy pension fund's new mascot, the cat girl.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sauter. This was a very interesting, intriguing presentation. So now we have 30 minutes of questions. So if you have any question, please raise your hands or just write down on the chat box, and I'm going to read it out loud. So we got one question by Chita Patel and one by Maylis Avaro. So perhaps we can have those two and then group others. So Chita.
Hi, fantastic presentation, Dr. Sauter. I have an odd question. Do you know Kavita Philip? But I have two questions that pertain to the history of pension funds, which I've been studying, actually, pension funds from the 1300s onwards. So,
I don't go back that far.
My questions are very particular, partly because way before Jacob Hacker, I was actually thinking about the notion of a risk shift, but specifically in relation to South Asia. But let me start with the pension fund that I'm doing the most work on, which really is a fund from the late 1700s that reconstitutes the idea of the welfare state. And it's an interesting fund because it was started by people who were liable to be indigents, end up in prison, vagrants, so the whole idea of vagrancy itself and managing vagrancy financially historically had been given to things like relief funds, right? Temporary vehicles, if you will, in contemporary language. But this particular pension fund was formed in a way that's very familiar to us, with part of your salary going towards producing the fund. And the East India Company, this was East India Company employees in a particular place called Madras, because Madras was broke. Now, the thing that's interesting about this pension fund is that it was a kind of a particular kind of vehicle, with the potential pensioners being the people who ran the fund, right? And they circled, they sort of took turns. It was a whole bunch of it was invested in what we might call treasuries in a broker company. And a bunch of money was invested in debt, right? In what you would now call debt. So all of this was actually, it was interesting because a lot of it was incredibly risky funding, right? And it actually, one of the things that I've been writing about for a while is actually thinking about pension funds, not just as a vehicle that enables the sort of possible, let's say, the life of labor after superannuation, after retirement, or, sort of, again, I've been writing about this for a long time, thinking about it as an extension of wage, which the East India Company deliberately articulated as such in the 1860s, right? So they understood that in order to help the state survive, they needed to think of the pension fund as wage. So really thinking about the pension fund as a form through which the corporation and the country also built a life, a longevity for itself, right? So it's a different way of thinking about it. Now, the thing is, so basically, it's interesting because those pension funds actually assumed a double risk, right? The risk for the pensioner and the risk for the person or the entity whose debt was invested in the fund was big, right? So now, so that's a very different model of thinking about pension funds in the standard history. And it's very much like a 401k model, right? So, you know, so the idea, so, and I mean, looking at what's happening globally, because I do this, is really thinking about what you're thinking about, which is a couple of different things, which is that actually one of the things I was thinking about with you was that the movement from the individual to to an entity, to a group, resembles the way in which risk pools are constituted, right? So to think about, which I've actually talked to queer communities about, like, how do you think about risk in the form of pooling? So anyway, so so I wanted to ask about that because there's a particular geopolitical history of pension funds that imagines 401k as a new vehicle, right? One of the things this does, partly because you have a corporate government entity, right? In the late 1700s, that it has a completely different history. The other thing I was thinking about was actually, you know, so how do you think about the sort of shift? Is there a shift in making risk pooling central in the 1970s and slightly later, making risk pooling central to how to understand the idea of an entity itself, right? So not just in the fund, but in a Foucauldian way, the way in which a kind of formation of governance was constituted, right? So what I tracked in India is, and you know, a student of mine tracked in Shanghai and another student tracked in Vietnam, is post 1990s, you know, when the dollar was, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in pension funds, which isn't articulated. There's an ecology of finance and governance that's geopolitical that American pension funds are already also tied into, right? And so, you know, I'm thinking also one of the things that's happening, which you're alluding to without sort of having said it explicitly, is the movement from defined benefit to defined contribution, which was implicit in what you're articulating, right? Because with a 401k, the push is to move to defined contribution and shift the risk of the benefit onto labor, right? That's happening globally in relation to what's happening to the dollar and American debt. So the other thing I'd like you to think about is what's going on in the 1970s. So partly this ties into in a weird way to the 1790s, because it has to do with the debt of the government, right? So what happens when, you know, government debt and the dollar as reserve currency is under threat, and how much does that then work into how pension funds are constituted? Because I actually know a bunch of people who've been doing pension fund investment since the 70s. And one of the things pension funds are one of the largest flows of global capital in the world, right? Period, bar none, right? Literally. So, you know, so you're actually thinking about capital globally turning dollar denominated in a particular way, underwriting the dollar at a time at which pooling of funds and people as a collective rather than an individual actually gets legal heft. I mean, you know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, this is a really good set of questions and a really great set of observations. What I've been focusing, so this project and this talk isn't necessarily a great reflection of the whole project, because I'm mostly focusing on like this specific group of people. And this particular document that they produce, because I got access to the archives of the task force. And so it's just a huge amount of like internal material about like what they're saying to each other and transcripts of all their meetings. And I also just found some other stuff in the National Archives from the Department of Labor and their meetings about the revision of the ERISA prudence standard, which gives me a great opportunity to do like some really interesting microhistory as far as I'm concerned. And so there are a couple of things that I'm interested in here, but one of the things that's really clear in the task force archives and the way what they are saying to each other and what they say in public. So they have both the things they say to each other, the things that they are doing research on and they're exchanging memos about, and then the things they're going out and saying in the broader public in terms of like not only the report that they published, but also like all of the interviews they do around the report. There's a huge amount of media. They do a lot of media work around this white paper, which is which is interesting. And then there's also obviously like Casey publishes a number like law review articles promoting different things that the report is advocating for, including some SEC rule revisions. So there are a couple of things that I'm interested in here. One is the incredibly fast back and forth that's occurring at the policy level. So ERISA is after like this long gestational period, passed in 1974. It is immediately attacked by everyone involved on the financial side with pensions, but also the general financial community, because it's seen as being highly restrictive and creating all of this work about how you are supposed to justify all of these different investment decisions you make. But there's a set of SEC rules that had been passed also in like 1974 and 1975, that were passed when Casey was the head of the SEC, which is a whole nother thing, that he was in favor of as the head of the SEC. Couple of years later, some stuff happens to his personal portfolio. He gets to the task force and suddenly he's like, I don't think these rules are good anymore. And we should roll them back immediately. And they do. And like the SEC personally credit, like the SEC's like rulemaking document is like, we're doing this because of what Casey wrote in this report and in this law review article. So I'm very interested in that sort of very quick, we have this set of things that are passed that are very like directly about protecting small investors. So the SEC rules that are being targeted here are about disclosure rules and rules against hard selling and rules about protecting people who may be targeted for unregistered security placements. And all of those get rolled back within a couple of years. And then there's ERISA, and ERISA and the Department of Labor come out very strongly where they're like, no, this is making more work for you. You're right. Like, we're doing this on purpose to make it harder for you to make stupid choices. And then a couple of years and a couple of like rounds of this debate go, and then they're like, okay, fine, modern portfolio theory, yay. And then it all just sort of proceeds to collapse at a policy level, like this weird little stack of dominoes. And so I'm interested in sort of how these ideas get around, how in particularly the US context, these ideas are justified, because one of the things that people are this group of people are saying, and this group of sort of their financier like contemporaries are saying, is there is as you know, like there is cash concentration in pension funds. Right. And I would really like that. Yeah. I want that. And one of the reasons why actually Charles Lee, who I mentioned very briefly in this talk, is seen as so influential, is at New Court in like 1974. Charles Lee and his boss, whose name I'm currently blanking on, had sort of reformed New Court as a limited partnership, institutionally funded firm. They had been like, we should try this, like, let's give it a shot. And they had been using pension funds as their institutional capital. And then like literally like a year or a month later, ERISA passes and they lose all of that. And so one of the reasons why Charles Lee ends up being such a pivotal figure is because he is in a personal position to be like, oh, but I know that there's money there. I know that there's money there because I had it 2 weeks ago. And so he personally does a lot of lobbying of different members of Congress and different members of the Department of Labor at like golf clubs. And he talks about it in his sort of his venture capital oral history project testimony that's held at Berkeley. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from on this project is like, this is a very, like, this is a pretty micro history project of like, what are these people saying? How are they moving this story around? How are they creating this justification? Like, I always love it when they're like, they refer to personal savings and pension funds as idle money. Like it's idle. It's like idle hands. It's just causing trouble. Gotta put it to work. And there's this whole thing about like, we also get in here the whole debate about like the justification of venture investment as labor, as work. We're doing work. This is putting money to work, building America. And it's better than the idle money that the labor class had previously put away that isn't doing anything. And so that's another part of the project is like, what's the story about venture capital that's being constructed here? Because there's a really intentional story and figure being built of the venture capitalist. And I couldn't unfortunately go into it in detail in this talk because I have a lot of stuff about it and it takes a while to get through it all. But they're doing really intentional character building in this document and other documents. And that's also a thing that I care a lot about in this project is like, who is this character that's being presented? How is it being constructed as part of American history? You might have guessed by the presence of Casey, like they really care about the Americanization of the world and Pax Americana and going out and like using American industry to Americanize the rest of the planet. And that's a thing that comes up a lot in these documents is we're going to use venture capital to install factories and to go out and use this funding model specifically to create more American influence. And that's something that you end up seeing throughout Casey's career. Like after he gets to the CIA, it just keeps coming up and keeps coming up.
That's actually, thank you. That's great. I love the project. And I just have one very quick thing to say, and then there's a great question that sort of ties into the kind of stuff you actually closed with, which is I'm actually working on this project, thinking through pensions, foreign debt, with a bunch of people throughout in 4 different countries. But one of the things we're thinking about, which ties into idle funds, is this notion of unspent funds, right? Literally. And so we're thinking about funds in labor pools, right? Put in by governments that is never spent. And so one of the really interesting things that you're talking about is how do those funds become idle, like literally, and end up getting spent elsewhere, right? So literally, how do you mobilize those funds to not return them to labor, but move them into another terrain? And what sorts of figures are constituted? What kinds of figurations are produced in that and produced as necessary to that project, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Anyway.
before you answer that, we have 4 more questions. So I think it would be good to listen to a couple of more. So Maylise and then Viren.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I had actually 2 questions. The first one was about the theory of portfolio, because you mentioned Markowitz, but I was curious to hear, is Hickman playing a role in the thinking, because he's famous for having driven the high-yield movement. And so I was surprised not to hear Michael Milken and Drexel being around this legislation, because I think it's more or less the same period. And I really advocate of bringing high risk into portfolio. I wonder if they were there. And the second question was, you say there is this risk shift, but is this reflected in the performance? Like, are there more or less default troubles or success profit in the sector after the change, after this risk shift you described?
Second part first, I can't get access to the performance data from pension funds. They don't tend to share that, so that I don't know. I can only sort of look at what is happening sort of at a policy level, and like that's where that conclusion comes from. And your first question, I am mostly looking at connections that I can make between that I can make in the archive. So there is a connection between Markowitz, Friedman, and Casey. There are fewer sort of like apparent connections between other thinkers at that time, and so that's just sort of so that's how that connection is being made.
Viren. Perhaps Viren, are you there? You still have your raised hand. So Myra Wilkins has a question on chat. I'm going to read it and then Viren can go ahead. Does the topic of inward into the US foreign ownership figure in the studies of prudence and risk? And before you answer, Viren, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you very much. I love the talk, and in particular, because of a couple of things. One is that as a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics, my own topic is very closely related to yours, which is I'm actually researching finance and the rise of the biotech industry in the US. And I hardly need to tell you that the biotech industry was heavily influenced by venture capital. And I have also been pointing to the shift on ERISA as one of the key factors that led to the rise of the biotech industry. So that's the context of my question. I have basically three questions related to that, given this context. The first is, and this is a subjective judgmental question more than sort of specific to your research. The first question is, while I completely agree with you that this may have been fostered by sort of almost, the financial industry trying to sort of serve capital from the lay investor, or seem to have the effect of building high-tech industries, particularly the information technology industry and the biotech industry. So that's point number one. Point number two is in the course of my own work, I'm realizing that the other so the ERISA shift was one important factor in making in creating the venture capital industry. That's what I tend to believe. But the other factor is also the rise of endowments around the same time, I've done some analysis which suggests why endowments are actually also had a risk shift around the same time, which is not to do with ERISA, because they obviously, endowments have nothing to do with ERISA, but I'll be happy to sort of talk about that. It's a longer topic. I don't want to distract everyone. And the third thing is, believe it or not, this is 2023. If you look around the world, there are many countries, the UK, where I'm currently speaking from, Singapore, for example, another country, many other European countries, who all want to replicate what happened with ERISA and the risk shift, and who all want, in fact, the UK even had, the UK government even set up a commission maybe 5-10 years ago to investigate how their pensions, whether they, how they can push their pension funds to take more risk and to take on these kind of risk investments. So that was my third question. So just more like an observation that whatever has come out of it, good, bad, or ugly, there are other countries around the world wanting to replicate exactly the same thing. So thank you again, fascinating talk, and I'd love to connect with you separately, to understand your sources and maybe after the talk, or I might drop you an email or something. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Please do shoot me an email. So there were a couple of questions there, and one of them was sort of like, and like you can tell me if this is the question or not. I think the first question was, how do we get this connection to high technology? How do we get the venture capitalist into the high technology sector? And this is a really great question, because in the early period that I'm looking at, so obviously like there existed sort of things that we call venture capital firms starting like shortly after World War II, we end up with like the major names like ARD, that is like in theory the first venture capital firm, and it works in technology because we end up having what is essentially this tumbling of technology out of the military. It needs to be commercialized, and so that's both at ARD, but that's also like Casey is also involved with that, weirdly enough. Like there is material in his biography that says like this is the thing he was really interested in, was like commercializing technology that was coming out of the military that he knew about from his time in the OSS, which is again very interesting, not going to get involved with right now. And this is a really interesting question, because then the venture capital investment community, in so much as it exists, which is sort of like pinned around INVICA, which is sort of the National Venture Capital Association, which is founded in the early 1970s and sort of is based miscellaneously out of Chicago. They are sort of all over the place. They're both all over the place in terms of like what they think venture capital is, but they're also all over the place in terms of what their investment is and where their funds are coming from. There are several members of INVICA who are actually like operating in like VC arms of like insurance companies or credit companies, and they're investing in a lot of things. And what I think is really interesting in the task force materials is we also see that confusion in the task force materials themselves. Casey's actually not initially interested in equity, early stage equity investment. In the task force materials, Casey is interested in venture capital as appearing as in-kind assistance and investment from large corporations to small corporations and small companies. And they end up sending out this survey to a bunch of different companies and getting like saying like, would you help a small company with like equipment or all this other stuff? And they get back these amazing responses that are like, why on earth would I do that? I'm not going to do that. Why on earth would anyone do that? So there's this really interesting moment where it's like everything's sort of confused. It's not necessarily in flux, but it's like there are a bunch of different things happening. People are doing all of these different strategies. And from the materials that I'm looking at, and this is why I'm interested in the sort of figuration that Gita was talking about, how are we figuring the venture capitalist in this space? And one of the things that they're doing, and that is specifically tied to the SEC rules that I was talking about, is one of the things they say when they're talking about why these SEC rules, which are like trying to put into place standards of disclosure for unregistered securities placements. So that the SEC is like, you have to tell people stuff about things if you're going to give them a security. So it doesn't matter if you're not ready to do an IPO yet. It doesn't matter if the security is unregistered. You still have to disclose information about your company to the person getting that security that is equivalent to the disclosure that you would have to do if this was an IPO. And the task force comes in and says, but venture capitalists are so interested in the future. They're so good at understanding the future and understanding the potential profitability of a company that they don't need all that information. And you shouldn't have to disclose it to the VC because it's just going to distract them. It's just going to waste time. You shouldn't have to engage with this. So they're building this figure of the venture capitalist who has a special relationship with the future, a special relationship with risk. And all of this ends up cohering around high technology because the people in this space, like these particular individuals, are arguing that not only does high technology have the potential to be the most lucrative for them personally, but also it fits in with this character they're building, which is just pushing further and further into an unregulated financial space where it's like, we need to reduce regulation in this space. And so as far as these guys are concerned, that's where the tech thing comes from. It's not because they were particularly interested in technology. Casey had investments in everything from orange juice to like cable companies or like broadcast consortiums. So while he was interested in technology and some of these other people were also had interest in technology, they weren't technologists. That wasn't what they were excited about. They were excited about building, as far as I can tell, they were excited about building this figure who would justify massive deregulation. And that's certainly what I've gotten from like their correspondence and their correspondence with other sort of sets of regulators. And I have now forgotten the other two questions.
So perhaps I could just because we are coming to the end, and I just didn't want to miss Myra's Wilkins's question.
Sorry.
Does the topic of inward into the U.S. foreign ownership figure in these studies of prudence and risk?
Oh yes, there is a whole period about Japan. There's the whole Japanese anxiety period that ends up being part of this, and that's really interesting and a thing that we could talk about a lot, but which I probably should not talk about. But yeah, this is definitely part of this, because as this group of people are establishing this like very patriotic investment figure, there's also again that huge period of anxiety where everyone's like, Japan is moving into this sector, and like that's why you need to take the gloves off the U.S. venture capitalists, and that happened sort of in the 90s. But that's a further move of deregulation, where it's like in order to compete with these not only foreign investments that are coming in, but also foreign technology, we need to further deregulate the U.S. investment sector and the U.S. VCs in particular to let them have more ownership. Now, this gets really interesting with my other set of projects, which are about the Canadian innovation economy and the connections between US industry and the Canadian innovation economy, which is a whole thing in and of itself. And that's also about like US ownership and movement into the Canadian sector. And I can talk about that for hours, but I won't. But yeah.
Awesome. And I'm just going to throw two last questions, and we can probably talk about it in more detail in Detroit. But the first that I was, because you're interested in this micro history of the process, I was wondering if you also trace the kind of change in the interest groups from the first issue of the Aris Act in 74, and then the reading of the Prudence Standard in 79. Even if the composition of the venture capitalist during the decade, throughout the decade, kind of becomes an important figure in this process of lobby. And the other thing, I was just so interested in your reading of Markowitz, the difference between, the risk of the portfolio and the risk of the system. So there is this construction of a dissonance in different understandings of risk. And perhaps like the venture capitalist, he does not only have a special relationship with the future, but also with this dissonance, and the institution, the persons who can like read and make something useful of this dissonance.
Yes, that is definitely a thing that they're saying, and they say it a lot. And there's also this wonderful anxiety they have about proving that they're not gambling, which is delightful and terrible. Regarding your first question, I haven't done that work specifically because it's been, I think, very well done by Michael McCarthy in Dismantling Solidarity, which is about a much more detailed read about sort of the varying interest groups that are surrounding the pension reform set of laws and ERISA in particular. So I particularly have not spent a lot of time in that space because like just McCarthy's already done it, and it's a great book, and I highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of thing.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for your absolutely interesting, fascinating presentation, and thank you all for coming, and we invite you to our next session on March 13th. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.